Aperture priority, or aperture value as it's also known, is one of the most versatile of the semi-auto modes on your DSLR camera. It's brilliant, I use it all the time. I thought it would be a good idea to come down to Bournemouth, go on the seafront, in the sunshine, beach huts, great place to demonstrate it. Best laid plans of mice and men, pouring with rain on the day of the shoot. Luckily, I have a mate in Bournemouth who's got one of the biggest shops you ever did see, and it's full of really shiny things that we can use to photograph. See what I mean? It's like being in a great big grown-up boys sweetie shop, isn't it, this place? Now all these bits and pieces, they're nice and sparkly. They make some really interesting pictures. But surprisingly, a place like this is much harder to photograph than you might imagine. Because there's so much going on, it's quite hard to separate the subject matter of your image from what's going on in the background and all around it. Things can start to look a bit cluttered. Aperture priority is a brilliant mode to use in circumstances like this. First of all, what does it do? How does it work? When you're in aperture priority mode, it's kind of the next step on from fully auto. It gives you control of the aperture of the camera, as well as your ISO and your white balance. Now, as you open up your aperture, obviously more light comes in through the lens and it has an effect on exposure. And the opposite happens when you go the other way. When you close it down to a small aperture, you've got much less light coming in. As you change that aperture in aperture priority mode, the camera will go away and find you the relevant shutter speed to work in the lighting conditions you're working in. Because sadly, there isn't a correct exposure. So like indoors, it's a 5th at f8 or something. There is nothing like that. It is all fluid and moving around. Let's have a look. So I'm in aperture priority. I'm going to set an aperture of f8. No reason, I'm just choosing f8. Now, if I point the camera over there, I'm getting 1/8 of a second at f8 because it's not very bright in here. In a way, it's quite good we had to come in out of the rain because we can see the changing shutter speeds much more accurately. 1/8 of a second at f8 pointing over there. If I point it at the skylight above Jane and her camera, it shoots straight up to a 45th of a second. So the aperture isn't changing, but the camera is changing the shutter speed to work with the aperture that I've chosen. The question that's probably burning in all your minds is, why would I want to change the aperture if the camera is going to mess about and find shutter speeds to work with it? Let's go and have a look and I'll show you. Now, remember what I said about these exciting but cluttered environments? It's very easy to lose your subject into the background. So you've got to be very careful and selective as you select it. I'm going to use this bike here because it's a real wide machine. It's a true fat man's motorcycle and I love it. This front tyre, it's about the size of the rear tyre of a Ferrari. It's tremendously, it has a great presence sort of going on there. The shot I want to use is the dramatic power of the front end of the bike, running back through the length of it. And then up on the stand there, we've got this beautiful old retro bike, which incidentally, Mark and his team here built for Formula One racing driver Jackie Stewart's son. Paul Stewart, he's the man who owns it. Cool, eh? Let's get our shot set up. I'm using a wide angle lens for this one. So this is about aperture priority and a wide angle lens. Now, a wide angle lens is a very wide field of view. There's lots going on, particularly tricky to isolate things. It also has an enormous depth of field inherently. So you'd want to use that if you want lots of depth of field, everything sharp front to back. You wouldn't use a wide lens if you want to start separating it out. And it would look a bit odd with a shot like this if you had blurry bits and sharp bits. First thing, get the composition under control. I use live view quite a lot for this because it's just easier. Got to use a tripod because we're indoors in lowish light. There we go. I'm going to put a bit of a tilt on the camera because I think it's good, it's wacky, it's dynamic, it's engines and buoys and bikes and stuff. Next step, set up the exposure, set up what we want. Aperture priority, I'm going to choose f16 because it's a very small aperture. It's not the extreme aperture, this lens goes to f22, but I'm going to use f16 because it's going to be not quite at the extreme of the lens, so we'll get the best quality we can, but it's going to be maximum depth of field. So, aperture priority, we set f16. The camera is dealing with the exposure. That has set a 1 second exposure. There's going to be 2 clicks. Click as it opens, 1 second later, click as it closes. Got to use a tripod. Any movement, you've got a blurred picture. For that reason, I'm going to use self-timer to trigger it, because I don't want to be touching the camera at the crucial moment. Focus, I'm going to focus on this fork stanchion down here. Because the depth of field is so extreme, it will still be sharp all the way through. Just get that focus set up like that, self-timer, everything's ready to race, and just go for it. You just press the button, come back from the camera and don't touch it. There we go. Here we go, there's our shot. Brilliant, isn't it? We've controlled depth of field and what we want, and the camera has dealt with the exposure.